Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest tales of betrayal and vengeance. In today's story, a Mexican mechanic takes matters into his own hands after discovering his wife's shocking affair. In a small Mexican town, Enrique, a mechanic in his late 30s, lived a quiet life with his wife, Mariana, and their 2 children. Enrique was known for his strong work ethic and his devotion to his family. His days were spent in the local garage, repairing cars and motorcycles, while Mariana stayed at home, taking care of their children and managing the household. Their life was simple, but Enrique felt content, believing that his family was everything he needed. Mariana, on the other hand, seemed to have a different view of their marriage. While Enrique worked long hours in the garage, Mariana's world outside their home had started to change. She spent more time with friends, going out for coffee or shopping, and often returned late in the evening. Enrique didn't mind at first, assuming it was just her way of staying busy. However, over time he began to notice subtle changes in her behavior. She no longer seemed as interested in spending time with him, and when she did, it felt forced, as if she were distracted. At dinner, she would often stare out the window, lost in thought, and sometimes she wouldn't even respond to his questions. Despite these signs, Enrique never thought much of it. He trusted Mariana and believed in their marriage. He thought her recent behavior was just a phase, something that would pass with time. He had no reason to suspect anything more, especially after they had been married for over 10 years. Their relationship, though not perfect, had weathered many challenges, and Enrique felt secure in the life they had built together. However, unbeknownst to him, Mariana was keeping a secret that would shatter the foundation of their marriage. Over the past few months, she had started an affair with Alejandro, a wealthy businessman who had recently moved to the town. Alejandro was everything Enrique wasn't: charming, attentive, and full of life. He provided Mariana with the excitement and attention she had longed for. The 2 of them began meeting in secret, finding secluded spots where they could spend time together without anyone suspecting a thing. They talked about their dreams, their desires, and their future. Mariana found herself drawn to Alejandro's affections, feeling more alive than she had in years. But as the affair continued, guilt began to creep into Mariana's conscience. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the thrill of the secret kept her coming back. She couldn't bring herself to tell Enrique the truth, so she kept up the facade, living a double life. Enrique, oblivious to his wife's betrayal, continued to work tirelessly, believing that everything was fine in their marriage. Little did he know, his world was about to be torn apart. Enrique had always been a creature of habit, someone who followed a strict routine and rarely deviated from it. He woke up early every morning, worked long hours in the garage, and came home to spend time with his family. But recently, he began to notice small, unsettling changes in Mariana. She seemed more distant, preoccupied with something he couldn't understand. At times, she would stare off into the distance as if lost in thought, her eyes clouded with worry. Other times, she would leave the house without explanation, returning late in the evening with an air of secrecy surrounding her. One evening, after working late at the garage, Enrique decided to follow Mariana. Something felt off, and his instincts told him that something wasn't right. He had never doubted his wife before, but now the small inconsistencies were adding up, and his gut was telling him that he needed to know the truth. Enrique waited until Mariana told him she was meeting a friend for coffee. She didn't mention who it was, which was unusual. Normally, she would have given him some details, but tonight she was vague, almost too vague. Enrique decided to take a different route home, taking a detour through the town's quieter streets. He had no particular plan, but he needed to see for himself what was going on. As he drove through the town, he noticed Mariana's car parked outside a hotel. His heart began to race, and his mind instantly started piecing things together. He parked a few blocks away, trying to stay out of sight, and waited. It was then that he saw Alejandro, the man he had seen around town but never thought much about. Alejandro walked up to the hotel, his presence confident and casual. Enrique felt his pulse quicken as he watched them. He was certain now something was happening between them. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. Mariana and Alejandro had entered the hotel together, and the sight of them walking in without a care in the world made Enrique's stomach churn with disbelief. The shock of it all left him paralyzed, unable to move for a few moments. His mind raced, questioning everything he thought he knew about his wife. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Enrique couldn't bring himself to confront them then and there. He wasn't ready for that. He had to process what he had just seen, and the reality of his wife's betrayal crushed him. With a heavy heart and a broken spirit, Enrique quietly left the area, his mind consumed with anger, hurt, and confusion. He couldn't understand how Mariana could do this to him. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a downward spiral that would soon consume them all. In the days that followed, Enrique was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. His mind constantly returned to the image of Mariana and Alejandro walking into the hotel together. The betrayal weighed heavily on him, gnawing at his insides. He couldn't focus on his work, nor could he ignore the growing sense of betrayal that simmered within him. Every time he looked at Mariana, a cold, unbearable feeling settled in his chest. He tried to act normal around her, but the tension between them was palpable. Mariana, on the other hand, remained oblivious to Enrique's discovery. She continued with her usual routine, coming and going as she pleased, all the while hiding her secret affair. The guilt was eating her up inside, but her desire for Alejandro made it impossible to stop. She kept up the lie, believing that she could manage both lives without anyone noticing. Enrique, however, wasn't so easily fooled. At night, Enrique lay awake, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. He needed answers, but confronting Mariana seemed impossible. What would he say? How could he bring up the affair without destroying everything? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that confronting her wouldn't be enough. He wasn't just angry at her, he was hurt, deeply hurt. But he couldn't let it go. Enrique began to plan. He needed proof, something concrete that would confirm his suspicions once and for all. So, he followed Mariana again, watching her movements from a distance. He was careful, always keeping his distance, making sure not to be seen. He discovered that she had been meeting with Alejandro more frequently, sneaking around under the cover of darkness. Each time they met, Enrique became more and more certain of what he already knew: his wife was in love with another man. The anger that had been building inside him began to turn into something darker. He could no longer ignore it. The pain of being betrayed was consuming him, and a plan began to form in his mind. Enrique couldn't stand the thought of his wife leaving him for another man, especially one like Alejandro. He couldn't bear the idea of losing his family, his life, everything he had worked so hard for. The thought of losing her to someone else pushed him over the edge. Enrique realized that he needed to take control of the situation, to make sure this ended on his terms. He could no longer remain passive, pretending that everything was fine. As the days passed, he carefully prepared for the confrontation he knew was coming. It was no longer about saving his marriage, it was about revenge. The pain and betrayal had twisted something inside of him, and he was determined to make sure that he wasn't the only one who would suffer. The night of the confrontation arrived, and Enrique's heart raced with anticipation. He had been planning this moment for days, knowing that he had to act swiftly and decisively. The anger inside him had festered to a boiling point, and he could no longer stand the thought of Mariana and Alejandro living freely, unaffected by the destruction they had caused in his life. Enrique had everything prepared. He knew exactly where they would be, when they would meet, and what he needed to do. That evening, he waited in the shadows near a secluded area on the outskirts of town, the same place where Mariana and Alejandro had met before. Enrique had followed them to this spot many times, memorizing every detail of their rendezvous. His hands trembled as he gripped the weapon he had brought with him, trying to steady his nerves. The thought of what he was about to do made his stomach churn, but the pain and humiliation he felt outweighed any lingering hesitation. His mind was made up. Hours passed, and the sounds of the quiet town seemed to grow louder in Enrique's ears. He checked his watch again, waiting for the moment when Mariana and Alejandro would arrive. He had chosen this spot carefully, knowing that it would be dark and isolated. No one would hear their screams, and no one would see what he was about to do. His anger simmered, but it was also mixed with a deep sadness that he couldn't shake. He had once loved Mariana so completely, but now she was nothing more than a symbol of betrayal. Finally, he saw their car pull into the area. Mariana stepped out first, followed by Alejandro. Enrique watched them from the darkness, the glow of the headlights casting long shadows across the dirt road. They spoke briefly, laughing softly, unaware that their lives were about to come to a violent end. Enrique's heart thudded in his chest as he carefully approached them, keeping to the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. As Mariana and Alejandro stood close, their faces illuminated by the dim light of the car, Enrique stepped forward. Before they could react, he moved quickly, his emotions taking over as he lunged toward them. In an instant, everything turned chaotic. Mariana and Alejandro's surprised faces were the last things Enrique saw before the weight of his anger consumed him. The silence that followed was deafening. Enrique stood over their lifeless bodies, breathing heavily, the reality of what he had just done starting to sink in. The adrenaline coursing through his veins made everything seem surreal, but the finality of their deaths hit him hard. He had no time to dwell on the consequences he had acted, and now he had to disappear before anyone discovered what he had done. The pain that had led him to this moment seemed to dissolve, replaced by a cold emptiness as he fled the scene, leaving behind two bodies in the quiet darkness. The authorities quickly discovered the bodies of Mariana and Alejandro, and the small town was thrown into shock. The murders were brutal and seemingly without motive. Initially, the police were at a loss, unsure whether it had been a random act of violence or something more personal. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the crime was tied to someone with a close connection to the victims. The town had always been tight-knit, and secrets were hard to keep. It didn't take long before rumors began to spread about the couple's affair, and whispers about Enrique's behavior started to surface. Enrique's demeanor in the days following the murders raised suspicion. He had returned to his usual routine, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. He continued working in his garage, but something about his calmness seemed off to those who knew him. He wasn't grieving the loss of his wife or the affair that had shattered their marriage. Instead, he seemed eerily composed, almost as if nothing had changed. This behavior didn't go unnoticed, and soon, the police began to investigate him more closely. The first lead came when a witness reported seeing Enrique near the scene of the crime the night of the murders. A security camera in the area had captured his truck parked just a few blocks away from the secluded spot where Mariana and Alejandro had been killed. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to warrant further questioning. Enrique was brought in for questioning, and although he denied any involvement, the evidence was mounting against him. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Forensics revealed that Enrique's fingerprints were found on the weapon used to kill the couple. The police also discovered that Enrique had been following Mariana and Alejandro for weeks, gathering information and watching their every move. He had been planning the murders long before the confrontation at the hotel, and he had carefully chosen the night and the location to ensure the killings would go unnoticed. When Enrique was arrested, he showed no emotion. He calmly explained his actions, as though he had carried out a simple task. He spoke of betrayal, of the pain of being deceived by his wife, and of the rage that had consumed him. He showed no remorse, only a cold acceptance of what he had done. Enrique's lack of emotion stunned investigators and the community alike. What had once been a man of routine and simplicity had turned into a killer, and the town could hardly believe what had happened. The trial was swift, and Enrique was convicted of double homicide. The grief-stricken family of Mariana and Alejandro, along with the shocked community, could only try to make sense of the horror that had unfolded. Enrique's desire for revenge had cost him everything. He was sentenced to life in prison, but the pain he had inflicted on those around him would never fade. The story of Mariana, Alejandro, and Enrique became a dark chapter in the town's history, a reminder of how love, betrayal, and unchecked rage could lead to an irreversible tragedy.